In 1996, officers from the Chinese army, led by the head of Chinese intelligence, reached out to Xu Zengping, a former handball player who had transitioned to business. They tasked him with an ambitious operation aimed at enhancing the power of the Chinese Navy. The mission's ultimate goal was making the Chinese Navy one of the largest naval forces globally and capable of competing with the United States and achieve dominance over international waters in a manner similar to the United States. The mission was straightforward. Xu was to go to Ukraine and purchase an aircraft carrier that had previously belonged to the Soviet Union. He was to pose as a businessman planning to convert the carrier into a casino or floating nightclub. Although the story might seem fictional or even comedic, it happened. This development came as the French Navy's commander, 1 year ago, had announced to the French Parliament that China's naval advancements in the past 4 years were equivalent to the entire French Navy, a statement underlining the rapid growth and confirmed capabilities of the Chinese naval forces. This statement from the French Navy commander confirms that this information is accurate. The best proof of this assertion is that about 6 years ago, specifically in 2018, the Chinese president showcased his naval forces. Dressed in military uniform, he boarded one of the destroyers of the Chinese Navy and moved with the largest fleet in China's history in the South China Sea. This fleet consisted of 48 combat ships, along with aircraft carriers and submarines, and about 100,000 members of the Chinese Navy. The most important event that day was the statement made by the Chinese president while addressing the naval forces, emphasizing that building a Chinese naval force had never been as urgent as it is today, given the ongoing Cold War with the United States over maritime dominance, especially in regions close to China like the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Now, an important question arises. Was the Chinese president's statement serious, or just a random statement like those often made by leaders of most countries to gain public support? Let me assure you that his statement was indeed serious. The period from 2018, and even going back to 2015, witnessed the most significant development in the history of the Chinese Navy. According to a report by the U.S. Department of Defense on the Chinese Navy, in 2015, the number of combat ships owned by China, excluding aircraft carriers and submarines, was less than that owned by the United States. However, by 2020, the situation had changed, and China owned 60 more combat ships than the United States, making China the owner of the largest number of combat ships in the world. So, it's not just words, but a reflection of China's strategic military enhancements and aspirations on the global stage. Some argue that this does not necessarily make China the foremost naval power worldwide due to other factors, such as the number of nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers powered by nuclear energy, where the United States still leads significantly. Despite these discrepancies, China's naval forces are considered the second strongest globally, following only the United States, or, at the very least, ranking within the top 3 or 4. This remarkable progress is attributed to the comprehensive upgrades and expansions carried out over recent years. China has managed to secure a prominent position in terms of aircraft carrier ownership, even surpassing Russia, from whom it imported carrier technology. Moreover, China ranks among the top 7 nations for owning nuclear submarines, underscoring the intensifying competition expected in the coming years between China and the United States. This analysis is based on a report from the U.S. Department of Defense, lending credibility to the significant advancements made by China's naval forces. Today, let's talk about a single ship in the Chinese Navy, the Chinese aircraft carrier. Our story begins in 1970, the year the Soviet Union announced the completion of its first aircraft carrier for the armed forces. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union began testing this new aircraft carrier, intending to develop and produce more advanced versions. Indeed, after all these tests, in the early 1980s, the Soviet Union started building a more advanced series of aircraft carriers. These ships were supposed to be equipped with 12 P-700 missile defense systems. Building such large ships or aircraft carriers takes years, one of the main reasons being the very high cost of manufacturing them. The construction of these ships continued until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, and during this period, the Soviet Union split into about 15 countries, including Ukraine. Following the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1992, Ukraine inherited a significant share of military equipment, including ground weapons such as armored vehicles and tanks, air defense weapons like the S-300, and naval ships and destroyers, among which were aircraft carriers. In addition to all these weapons, there were 6,000 nuclear bombs, but an agreement between Ukraine and Russia resulted in Russia taking all of Ukraine's nuclear weapons. You might now wonder why Russia took the nuclear weapons, but left other important assets like aircraft carriers, ships, and defense systems. The primary reason Russia didn't claim the aircraft carriers is that they were incomplete. Completing these aircraft carriers would require exorbitant costs, and the Soviet Union, which had become Russia after collapse, was in a very difficult economic and political situation, unable to afford such massive military expenditures, especially for a group of aircraft carriers. Let's also look at the situation in Ukraine. After gaining independence from the Soviet Union, Ukraine was in a difficult economic and political state, and was among the most corrupt countries in the world. The Ukrainian government stated it couldn't afford to spend billions of dollars to develop and complete the construction of aircraft carriers, especially since it had other weapons like the S-300 air defense system, tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment, which most of them were eventually scrapped or sold as junk. Consequently, Ukraine opted to sell off much of its military hardware, including these carriers. At this time, they offered all or most of their ships for sale, including a group of aircraft carriers, not just one. They had at least two, one from the model developed in the 1970s, and another more modern one that was supposed to have begun construction in the 1980s. Many countries at that time, most notably China and Australia, began looking into how to purchase these aircraft carriers. In the same period, the 1990s, China was emerging from its internal troubles and started opening up to the world, attracting investments from Western countries and the United States. The Chinese government was concerned about trying to buy the aircraft carrier openly, fearing it could cause problems with the West. So, the Chinese government backed out of purchasing Ukraine's available aircraft carrier. However, the People's Liberation Army and intelligence decided this was an unmissable opportunity. They needed to find a way to circumvent any potential issues with the West and acquire the aircraft carrier, even if the central government itself rejected the idea. A group of officers from the People's Liberation Army and the head of intelligence reached out to a businessman and former handball player known as Xu Zengping. They told him about a plan to go to Ukraine and buy the aircraft carrier from the Ukrainian government, pretending to turn it and a group of other ships into casinos or floating nightclubs. They warned him that if any problems arose from this deal, he would be personally responsible. Believing he was undertaking a patriotic mission that history would remember, he agreed to the mission, unaware of the eventual outcome, which we will learn at the end of this episode. An important question remains: how would this businessman begin his plan? They started their story in Macau, a region in China, but was under Portuguese control from the colonial era until 1999, when China regained control. Why was this region chosen by intelligence as the starting point for their plan? Macau, a region in China, was under Portuguese control until 1999, making it a unique blend of Eastern and Western cultures. This historical colonial period left Macau filled with casinos and nightlife venues, attracting business people and government officials from around the world. Recognizing the strategic advantage of this setting, Chinese intelligence and military officials decided it was the perfect location for businessman Xu Zengping to begin his covert operation to acquire an aircraft carrier from Ukraine for China. They established a company in Macau with a starting capital of $6 million for Xu. Indeed, they started their plan in 1996, and Mr. Xu went to Macau, where he spent time getting to know government officials and businessmen until he encountered a group of Ukrainian officials. Through these officials and bribes, he learned exactly who could finalize the aircraft carrier deal with him. Then, in 1998, he went to Ukraine, met the company's official responsible for the aircraft carrier, met government officials, and began negotiating the deal. After discussions and deliberations lasting about 4 days and many bribes to Ukrainian officials, he convinced them to sell him the aircraft carrier, claiming he would turn it into a casino or floating nightclub in China. Interestingly, he told the Ukrainian officials he couldn't pay the $20 million up front and could only do so after a year. Surprisingly, they agreed, provided he pay an additional $10 million in delayed payment fees, effectively serving as interest. However, this $10 million was likely to end up in the pockets of the Ukrainian officials rather than the Ukrainian state itself. The evidence for this will become clear as we see how the Chinese government dealt with this situation. After a few days from signing the agreement with the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government informed Xu that they would hold a tender for all companies interested in purchasing their ships, including him, and that the deal they made was cancelled. Did Xu give up? Of course not. With his good network among Ukrainian businessmen and officials, he managed to bribe his way into making the deal favor him by ensuring his bid was complete and the others were flawed, or at least set a price that would secure him the deal. Thanks to these bribes, and given Ukraine's notorious corruption, he managed to acquire the aircraft carrier. You might wonder if the intelligence agencies worldwide, including Europe and America, were unaware of these happenings. Isn't the story somewhat comedic or farcical? Absolutely not. Such a matter couldn't have gone unnoticed by Western intelligence and the CIA. Investigations into the Chinese businessman revealed that the company he founded in Macau was fictitious and had no real headquarters in the area. Western intelligence considered two possibilities. Either he was genuinely a businessman, needing to buy the aircraft carrier and other ships to turn them into profitable floating casinos and nightclubs in China, or he was affiliated with the Chinese government or military, intending to strengthen China's naval forces. Regardless, Western intelligence didn't show significant concern because they believed the aircraft carrier was dilapidated and incomplete, with about 70% finished and without its missile defense systems or electronic systems installed. Only the ship's body and engines were complete, so even if the Chinese military acquired it, it wouldn't be much use due to rust. However, China was focused on another aspect entirely. It demanded the blueprints for the aircraft carrier from Ukraine, understanding that a ship of this size and complexity required detailed plans for assembly and disassembly. Through negotiations, the Chinese businessman convinced the Ukrainian government to provide the blueprints, arguing he needed them to convert the ship into a casino or nightclub. China didn't waste time requesting the blueprints even before the aircraft carrier itself was moved, considering the blueprints alone, which would save years of research, development, and funds, to be the most crucial part of the deal. In the end, the businessman acquired the blueprints and the aircraft carrier without paying a penny up front. But then came the bigger challenges. How to transport the aircraft carrier from the Black Sea off the coast of Ukraine to China. The first hurdle was convincing the Turkish government to allow the ship to pass through its straits. According to the Montreux Convention, Turkey had the right to prohibit the passage of military ships, especially if they were large enough to cause problems if stranded during their transit. The Chinese government reached out to Turkey for permission to pass the aircraft carrier, but Turkey initially refused, citing the ship's enormous size and potential to obstruct traffic in the Turkish straits. At the time, China wasn't a significant global force and lacked leverage over Turkey. The aircraft carrier remained stationed at the entrance of the Turkish Straits for several months from 2000 to November 2001, with China paying Turkey a daily fee of $8,500, a significant amount in 2001. After months of negotiations, China convinced Turkey by offering attractive deals related to economics and tourism. Turkey agreed under the condition that if any problems occurred or traffic was obstructed, China would bear the additional costs. Despite a severe storm causing the ship to run aground and the death of a worker overseeing its passage, the two governments managed to get the ship back on course, and it passed through all the Turkish straits to the Mediterranean Sea. The journey didn't end there, as China faced a potential repeat of these difficulties with Egypt regarding the Suez Canal. Opting to avoid these issues, China chose the longer route around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. The aircraft carrier passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, circled Africa and the Indian Ocean, and finally arrived in China in 2002, turning a journey that began in 2000 into a multi-year saga. Upon the aircraft carrier's arrival in China in 2002, a significant phase of renovation and upgrade was initiated by the Chinese. The first steps involved removing parts that had succumbed to rust, incorporating proprietary missile defense systems, and making the carrier capable of accommodating dozens of Chinese aircraft, specifically the J-15 model. This effort has made China the second largest operator of aircraft carriers globally. As the narrative progresses, China's ambitions do not merely rest with refurbishing an old vessel. There's an ongoing quest to advance its fleet of aircraft carriers to operate on nuclear power. This transition would signify a monumental leap in naval capabilities, positioning Chinese carriers to project power across global waters akin to the United States, thereby altering the balance of naval power significantly. China didn't just acquire a ship, it gained blueprints that allowed it to potentially build its own carriers, significantly saving on years of research, development, and funding. Despite paying only $20 million for the carrier, China refused to pay an additional $10 million in late payment fees, arguing it only had invoices for the original amount. This maneuver ensured the corrupt Ukrainian businessmen expecting the extra $10 million for facilitating the deal were left empty-handed. In a strategic move highlighting its broader naval ambitions and technological prowess, China purchased a second aircraft carrier. This acquisition, an older model, wasn't destined for frontline duty. Instead, China transformed it into a military museum, offering a tangible piece of history and technological study to both the public and military enthusiasts. This entire episode underscores not just China's strategic depth in expanding its naval power, but also its shrewd financial negotiations and willingness to exploit the corrupt practices within other nations to its advantage. It showcases a blend of military upgrading, technological innovation, and diplomatic navigation, revealing the complex layers of global power dynamics and the lengths nations will go to bolster their strategic posture on the world stage. However, the businessman who played a critical role in this national mission for China was imprisoned in 2001 before the carrier even arrived in China. Additionally, the head of Chinese intelligence involved in the operation was jailed for corruption. This story highlights China's long-term strategy of importing technology rather than weapons, including space rocket engine technology from Russia, fighter jet technology, and aircraft carrier blueprints, alongside other technologies acquired or stolen from the United States. The tale of acquiring the aircraft carrier for a mere $20 million, now worth billions, underscores China's ambitious and strategic approach to military development.